March 9, 1945. Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. The meeting room smelled of tobacco, ink, and fatigue. Generals hunched over maps of the home islands, tracing circles around cities already marked with ash. Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka, each name crossed out in red pencil. Outside, the air raid sirens had fallen silent for the first time in weeks. The officers took it as mercy. It was not. At 7:48 p.m., the radar screen at Omori Air Defense Station began to pulse. Multiple echoes, bearing south, distance 500 kilometers. Altitude high. Too high for fighters. An operator leaned closer. The signals multiplied until they filled the entire scope. His voice cracked. 100! No, 200 aircraft inbound. Across the bay, the order went out. Prepare interceptors. Scramble night fighters. But there were none left. Japan had fuel for barely a dozen planes, and most sat grounded with empty tanks. The officer on duty whispered the words no one wanted to hear. They're coming from the Volcano Islands. Until that moment, no one in Tokyo truly believed it possible. Those barren specks, Saipan, Tinian, and Iwo Jima, had been dismissed as irrelevant rocks. Now, they were the launch pads for the deadliest bombing campaign in human history. Half a world away, at Tinian Airfield, 334 B-29 superfortresses prepared for takeoff. It was the largest single bombing mission ever conceived. Operation Meeting House, a strike not with precision bombs, but with fire itself. Each B-29 carried up to 8 tons of M69 and centuries. Thin, magnesium-cased bomblets filled with napalm gel. Designed not to destroy buildings but to ignite cities. The bombs would fall in clusters, explode at 2,000 feet, and scatter flames across entire neighborhoods. On the tarmac, ground crews moved like ants under the floodlights. Engines roared, propellers spun, and the volcanic dust of Tinian whipped through the humid night air. Major General Curtis LeMay, commander of Vitiated Bomber Command, watched from his jeep. He had stripped the B-29s of their defensive guns to make room for more fuel and fire. His logic was brutal and simple. If we fly low and fast enough, they won't need guns. The Japanese can't hit what they can't reach. At 8:12 p.m., the first superfortress, call sign Z-21, lifted off the runway. Its 4 Wright R-3350 engines bellowed into the dark, trailing flame. One by one, the others followed, giant silhouettes climbing into the night sky. By midnight, more than 300 bombers were en route, each carrying the weight of a small apocalypse. They cruised at altitudes under 8,000 feet, barely half their normal height, to stay below radar and maximize fire spread. From above, the Pacific looked peaceful, black water glimmering with moonlight. But the men knew that below lay the ocean graves of hundreds of B-29 crews who hadn't made it back. Inside one bomber, the city of Los Angeles, Sergeant James Pruitt adjusted his oxygen mask and stared at the map pinned to his knee. He could barely see the target outline. A crude grid of Tokyo's eastern wards. Shitamachi. Wooden homes, narrow alleys, rivers, perfect fuel. His bombardier leaned over. "Ever seen a city burn from the air?" Pruitt didn't answer. He just muttered, "Not yet." At 12:08 a.m., the first radar echoes reached Tokyo's northern suburbs. Civilians sleeping in tatami mat houses awoke to the distant hum of engines. Deep, rhythmic, growing louder. They were used to bombings, but never this sound. It wasn't a whine or a shriek. It was a constant, low thunder. A young girl, Yumi Nakamura, age 12, stepped outside her home near the Sumida River. She looked up and saw faint glimmers moving across the stars. Then came the first explosions, dozens, then hundreds, each followed by a blossom of fire. The night sky turned orange. In the first 5 minutes, Tokyo ceased to be a city. The incendiaries fell like rain, Small, fast, relentless. They pierced roofs, bounced off walls, and burst into flaming tendrils that clung to everything they touched. Houses ignited within seconds. The wooden neighborhoods of Shitamachi, packed with workers' homes and paper mills, became a furnace. The fire leaped from street to street, driven by the March wind. Within half an hour, a wall of flame 3 miles wide roared through eastern Tokyo. The B-29s above could feel the heat through their fuselages. Pilots flying at 5,000 feet reported turbulence from the firestorm's updrafts. Some aircraft were lifted 1,000 feet by rising air currents. Others were nearly flipped over. Major Robert Morgan radioed back, "We're flying through hell." Below, Tokyo burned like no city in human history ever had. The temperature at street level exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The asphalt melted. The Sumida River boiled. People ran for the bridges, only to find them collapsing under the heat. Firestorms consumed the oxygen, creating tornadoes of flame that pulled victims off their feet and hurled them into the inferno. Witnesses later said the sound was unlike anything human ears were meant to hear. Thousands of screams blending into one continuous, endless roar. By 2:00 a.m., from 8,000 feet, the city was a single living organism of fire. The glow was visible from 150 miles away. The bomber crews had long ceased distinguishing targets. Their maps meant nothing now. There was only the storm. LeMay's radio operators in Guam reported the final strike signal. Target area, completely illuminated. It was military shorthand for annihilation. By 3:00 a.m., the B-29s began turning back, their bomb bays empty and wings glowing red from the reflected heat below. Navigator Lieutenant Pruitt looked down one last time. All he could see was a swirling mass of light, rivers of molten fire moving through what had once been Tokyo's heart. He whispered to himself, "God forgive us." Then he shut the window and began the long flight home. By dawn, the city was gone. From the air, the eastern half of Tokyo looked like the surface of the moon, gray, cratered, and smoking. The grid of streets had vanished. The rivers that once divided neighborhoods were now filled with black water and floating wreckage. The first reconnaissance. Photos arrived at Guam headquarters by 90 phone Homosumiton Mines Downer T.D. Down. A.M. Curtis LeMay stood over the prints in silence. The images showed an area of destruction larger than Manhattan, stretching from the Sumida River to Ueno. The analysts whispered the number. 15 square miles. Gone. LeMay exhaled through his cigar. Then we did our job. But even his hardened staff fell quiet as more photos came in. The outlines of bridges had melted into the water. Everywhere, black circles marked the remains of cisterns where people had fled to escape the flames. None had survived. In Tokyo, the survivors emerged into daylight that looked like dusk. Ash fell like snow. Entire districts were nothing but smoldering rubble. Nurse Tomoko Hara walked through the ruins of her neighborhood near Kamedo. She found the outlines of homes burned into the ground, ghostly imprints of where people had once stood. At the edge of a park, hundreds of bodies lay fused together, their forms indistinguishable. The air reeked of gasoline and charred wood. Her journal that day would later be used in the War Crimes Archive. We thought the sea had come to Tokyo, but it was fire that drowned us. American pilots returning to Tinian could still smell the smoke clinging to their flight suits. At debrief, one crewman said, "It wasn't a bombing, it was a cremation." Another whispered, "I saw the river glowing red." LeMay cut him off. "You saw victory. That's what you saw." The mission had killed more people than either atomic bomb would later claim. Over 100,000 dead, 1 million homeless. Yet the orders for the next wave were already being written. At Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, Admiral Fukudome arrived that morning to find his command burned out. He stood before the charred remains of hangars, their roofs folded like paper. Officers awaited instructions, but he said nothing for several minutes. Finally, he murmured, "This is what we built the Empire for, to burn it ourselves." The senior staff watched as he tore the cover off his operational map, the same one that had once tracked the B-29's altitude and range. He folded it neatly, placed it in a drawer, and locked it. The Japanese government censored reports of the firebombing, describing it as a minor attack. But word spread through the cities by rumor and refugee. By the next week, panic had replaced discipline. Rail stations overflowed with families fleeing Tokyo. Trains were packed with survivors carrying charred photographs and bundles of rags. Farmers on the outskirts refused to let them enter villages, fearing disease. The empire had begun to devour itself. Meanwhile, in the Volcano Islands, the B-29 crews prepared for their next mission. LeMay's new directive was clear: the same treatment for Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and Kawasaki. The strategy was no longer military, it was industrial extermination. On the flight line at Tinian, engineers refueled bombers while others reloaded the next payload of incendiaries. Each crate bore the stenciled label, ANM-69 Cluster. Japan use only. Crew Chief Earl Watson turned to his pilot and said quietly, "Feels like we're burning a country one neighborhood at a time." The pilot didn't reply. He just looked out over the Pacific and said, "And they still won't surrender." Inside Japan, the Air Defense Command grew frantic. Their radar operators tracked hundreds of aircraft nightly, but fuel shortages grounded most interceptors before they even reached altitude. The few that did manage to climb were shredded by the B-29's tail gunners or blinded by the glow of the burning cities below. Captain Katsuo Oki, one of Japan's last night fighter aces, later recalled, "We flew into a sky filled with embers. Our engines coughed, our guns jammed, and the heat seared our wings. I realized we were no longer fighting an enemy. We were fighting the atmosphere itself. The Americans called it urban renewal by fire. Each mission targeted a different city, repeating the same formula: low altitude, napalm clusters, crosswinds to feed the flames." By the end of March, 33 Japanese cities had been partially or completely destroyed. Industrial output dropped by 50%. Entire regions were without power or water, but still no white flag rose. LeMay was summoned to Washington for a briefing. When an officer questioned the morality of his methods, he replied coldly, "If we lose the war, we'll be tried as war criminals. But if we win, nobody will question it." He returned to Tinian that night and ordered new routes over Tokyo, lower, faster, and deadlier. By April, even the emperor's advisors could smell the burning cities from the imperial palace. The night sky glowed red to the horizon. Palace guards reported ash falling into the lotus ponds. An aide whispered to Hirohito, "The Americans have turned the islands themselves into volcanoes." The emperor said nothing. He simply turned toward the window and watched the smoke rise. At 2:30 a.m. on April 13th, the B-29s returned. Tokyo was bombed again, and again 2 weeks later. Each time the flames reached higher, consuming what little remained. A Japanese poet, Takashi Nagatsuka, wrote in his final notebook before his death in May, "There are no shadows left in Tokyo, only the light of things burning that used to be human." By May 1945, Tokyo had been attacked 11 times. Each time, more of the city vanished. Each time, Japan's faith in victory burned with it. The empire that had once dreamed of ruling Asia by sword and ship now faced its end from the sky. A sky that came from volcanic islands they had laughed at, dismissing as useless rocks. Tinian Island, 1945. A strip of volcanic rock only 12 miles long, Yet it had become the most powerful airbase in human history. From the sky, it looked like a giant blueprint of war. 6 parallel runways carved into coral, endless rows of silver aircraft glinting under the Pacific sun, and supply depots stacked higher than palm trees. The Americans had reshaped this island into a machine, one that breathed aviation fuel and exhaled fire. Every morning, the ground trembled as the B-29 superfortresses taxied in formation. Each plane carried enough fuel to cross 3,000 miles of ocean, enough bombs to erase a city, and enough men to witness the world changing. From this one island, the United States could strike anywhere in Japan, from Kyushu in the south to Hokkaido in the north. It was the weapon Japan had never believed possible. A fleet of land-based bombers operating directly from the very volcano islands they once called uninhabitable. Major General Curtis. LeMay walked the runway every morning before takeoff. He didn't smile, didn't speak much, and rarely looked at the horizon. His eyes were on the engines, the propellers, the mechanics, the numbers. To LeMay, the war was arithmetic. If one bomber can burn a square mile, then 300 can burn a city. He didn't invent that logic. He perfected it. The mission planners under him called it patterned destruction. They mapped Japanese cities not by names or landmarks, but by texture, wood density, roof material, wind direction. Each variable became a coordinate in the geometry of annihilation. When the briefings ended, LeMay's final words never changed. Light them up. At night, the crews gathered in the mess hall before long-range operations. Some prayed. Some smoked in silence. Others read the latest communiques, lists of bomb tonnage dropped, sortie counts, kill ratios. A notice pinned to the wall read, Target, Nagoya, Objective, Complete Combustion. The men understood what that meant. No one said destroy. They said combust. Tokyo had set the precedent. Each takeoff was a ritual. 4 engines roaring, a 140-foot wingspan lifting heavy with death. The B-29s climbed slowly, heavy with 500-pound incendiary clusters, leveling off at only 7,000 feet. Below them, the black ocean stretched toward Japan, indifferent, endless. Inside the cockpits, the heat was unbearable. There was no oxygen system at low altitude, only sweat and fumes. The bombardiers wore no helmets, only headsets, the kind that made the engine's vibrations sound like an unending heartbeat. For most of them, Japan wasn't even visible through the smoke. It was a target code, T1 012 N17. Letters that stood for cities, now erased from maps. At 1:01 a.m., March 19, 1945, Nagoya burned. At 2:30 a.m., March 25, Osaka. At 3:00 a.m., April 16, Kobe. Each night, the horizon glowed red in 3 directions. By the time the bombers returned to Tinian, the smell of smoke reached even the runways, carried 1,500 miles across the Pacific by upper winds. The island reeked of victory and gasoline. The crews began to joke grimly that they could tell what city they'd hit by the color of the ash that clung to their fuselages. Osaka left gray dust, Kobe white, Tokyo black. The ground crews stopped washing the planes. There wasn't enough water. So the B-29s shimmered under the sun like tarnished silver, streaked with soot and oil. Men began painting their nicknames onto the nose art. Firebird, Hell's Delivery, Ashmaker, Old Napalm, Burnin' Betty. Each flight was a story told in fire. In the ready rooms, LeMay's operations officers began showing new charts, ones that measured destruction not in acres or tonnage, but in percentage of city consumed. Nagoya, 44%. Osaka, 36%. Kobe, 56%. Tokyo, 99%. The pattern was unmistakable. Each city that burned surrendered a part of Japan's soul. But in Tokyo, the propaganda ministry reported minimal damage and swift recovery. It was a lie even their own ministers didn't believe. The Japanese Army's 1st Air Defense Division, headquartered near Yokohama, made one final report to the Imperial General Staff in early April. Enemy aircraft operate with impunity. We cannot intercept. We cannot climb to their altitude. We cannot defend the cities. We recommend immediate negotiation for peace. The response from the War Ministry was one line: continue resistance. The Emperor's will is unbroken. But even the Emperor could see the glow. At the Imperial Palace, night after night, Hirohito watched the horizon burn. His courtiers described him pacing by the window, hands clasped behind his back. He never raised his voice. He simply asked, "Are these still Japanese cities?" No one dared answer. In Tinian's operations control room, LeMay and his staff watched the radar plots of returning bombers. The missions were working too well. By May, the destruction was so complete that his analysts struggled to find new targets that still existed. At one meeting, a planner remarked, "General, at this rate, we'll have nothing left to burn." LeMay puffed his cigar, leaned forward, and said, "Then we'll find new ways to burn what's already ash." Behind those words lay the next phase, a mission so secret that only a handful of officers knew what it meant. In a locked hangar at the northern end of Tinian, 2 B-29s were being modified under armed guard. The crews didn't know why. They only knew the project's name: Silverplate. Soon, fire would no longer be the weapon. The sky itself would become one. May 1945, Northfield, Tinian Island. To the naked eye, it looked like another morning in the world's busiest airbase. Hundreds of B-29s lined up nose to tail, shimmering under the Pacific sun. But at the northernmost end of the island, beyond the regular hangars and fuel depots, something different was happening. Armed sentries guarded a new compound of Quonset huts surrounded by barbed wire. No one was allowed inside without a special black badge stamped A section. Mechanics whispered about it in the mess hall. A new kind of bomb, one too heavy for normal mounts. Others said it wasn't a bomb at all, but an experiment that could end the war in a single night. Inside those huts, engineers from Los Alamos worked silently over strange metal spheres. The files called them Little Boy and Fat Man. The planes being modified to carry them bore innocent names: Enola Gay and Boxcar. The crews didn't know they were about to step from the age of fire into the age of the sun. For months, the superfortresses had burned Japan piece by piece: Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, until there were barely any targets left that could burn. But Japan still refused to surrender. Even as half its cities lay in ruins, the imperial staff clung to the belief that America would tire first. In Washington, they called it strategic exhaustion. In Tinian, Curtis LeMay called it wasting fuel. He walked into the control bunker one afternoon and slammed a folder on the table. "We've dropped 100,000 tons of incendiaries. They still won't quit. Maybe it's time we dropped something they can't rebuild from." The men around him said nothing. They didn't need to. The decision was already moving, silently, bureaucratically, toward inevitability. That same week, Japanese officers meeting in the underground bunker beneath the Imperial Palace reviewed their own reports. Industrial capacity below 30%. Railways inoperative. Fuel reserves at 0. Cities without names. General Anami Korichika, Minister of War, pressed his palm against the table and said, "We must fight to the last. The spirit of Yamato cannot burn." But even as he spoke, the air outside carried the faint smell of smoke drifting from Yokohama, a reminder that spirit could not power an airplane or move a train. June 1945. Operation Starvation. The Americans mined Japan's remaining harbors, choking what little trade still survived. B-29s from Tinian and Guam scattered naval mines across the inland sea, cutting off Hokkaido's coal and Kyushu's rice. Every mission returned with fewer targets, fewer ships, fewer reasons to keep flying. Pilots joked bitterly that they were running out of Japan. Then, one night, an officer from the Manhattan Engineer District arrived at Tinian with sealed orders. LeMay read them twice. He didn't ask questions. He simply said, "Get the runways ready." In July, the new hangars at Northfield came alive. Special bomb-loading pits were carved directly into the coral. Deep trenches where the enormous weapons could be hoisted into the bellies of their planes. The engineers worked under floodlights, sweating through tropical nights. They spoke in equations, not orders. To them, war had become mathematics again, just on a scale no one could imagine. The island's air smelled of grease and ozone, and the ocean hummed with ships bringing in crates marked only U-235. Every man on the island knew something world-ending was taking shape, but no one knew what it would look like. Meanwhile, Japan waited in darkness. The radio broadcasts were silent except for imperial announcements urging unity and sacrifice. Children practiced bamboo spear drills in schoolyards that no longer existed. Fires still burned in Tokyo's ruins, smoldering months after the last raid. In Hiroshima, a city largely untouched so far, people whispered that perhaps the gods had spared them. They were wrong. August 6, 1945, 04:30 hours, Tinian Island. Colonel Paul Tibbets climbed aboard the Enola Gay. The runway lights flickered once, then went dark as the aircraft rolled forward. The engines roared, shaking the coral beneath the wheels. Within minutes, the plane lifted off, bound for a city most of the crew couldn't pronounce. 6 hours later, as the morning sun rose over Hiroshima, the sky opened. At 8:15 a.m., a flash brighter than lightning consumed the heart of the city. A fireball 1 mile wide ignited the air itself. The temperature beneath it reached 4,000 degrees Celsius. Concrete vaporized. People left shadows burned into the walls. Within seconds, 70,000 souls were gone. Within minutes, 90% of the city was gone. 3 days later, a second bomb fell over Nagasaki. Another city vanished. Another firestorm without flame. Japan's War Council met in silence. There were no maps left to study, no orders left to give. The generals who had once laughed at American technology now stared at photographs that showed the end of their world. The chief of the Imperial Air Defense Corps said it aloud. They have turned the volcanoes into stars. On Tinian, the crews of the atomic missions returned to quiet applause. No one celebrated. No one cheered. They had done what they were told, and stepped into history without understanding it. LeMay inspected the returning aircraft, his face expressionless. He tapped the fuselage and said softly, "This ends it, one way or another." And it did. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke to the nation by radio, his voice trembling, distant, almost mechanical. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We must endure the unendurable. The empire that once laughed at the idea of American planes reaching its skies now listened to the sound of silence. A silence brought from volcanic runways thousands of miles away. As the sun set over Tinian that evening, a mechanic watched the Enola Gay parked quietly at the end of the runway. Its silver wings reflected the red glow of dusk. He turned to another crewman and said, "We used to burn cities. Now we burn history." The other man didn't answer. He just watched the horizon where the Pacific met the sky. The same horizon from which, a year earlier, the first B-29s had risen to change the world forever. August 15, 1945. Tokyo, 12 p.m. A humid stillness hung over the ruined capital. The air smelled faintly of burned paper and rain. What was left of the imperial palace stood surrounded by rubble, an island of silence in a sea of ash. Inside, Emperor Hirohito sat before a microphone for the first time in his life. The recording engineers whispered instructions, careful not to look directly at him. The emperor's voice trembled as he read from the script, his eyes fixed on the kanji for endure. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We must bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable. Across the shattered nation, the people listened in stunned silence. Farmers stopped in fields. Soldiers knelt beside broken radios. In the ruins of Tokyo, survivors stood motionless in what had once been city streets. For the first time in centuries, the voice of the divine was not commanding battle. It was admitting defeat. At the Imperial General Headquarters, no one spoke after the broadcast ended. The most senior officers, men who had once sworn to die before surrender, now sat staring at the floor. General Anami Korechika, Minister of War, placed his sword on the table, bowed his head, and said softly, "The spirit of Yamato has reached its limit." That night, he performed seppuku in silence. His blood stained the same map where, months earlier, they had planned the decisive battle for the homeland. The empire had died not in combat, but in combustion. In the skies above, the B-29s were grounded for the first time in months, engines silent, bomb bays empty. The same planes that had once filled the night with thunder now sat quietly on the volcanic runways, their shadows stretching toward the sea. On Tinian, crews gathered around radios as the emperor's words were translated. Some didn't believe it. Others just stared toward the north, the direction of Japan, knowing the war they had fought without pause was finally over. One mechanic turned to his captain and asked, "So that's it? After all that burning?" The captain exhaled, watching smoke drift from his cigarette. "Yeah, the world's run out of things to burn." That evening, a tropical storm swept across the Marianas. The rain fell hard on the airfields of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, washing the soot from the bombers, clearing the smell of gasoline from the coral. For the first time, the Pacific was quiet. But under that rain, the weight of what had been done began to settle. Tinian's pilots had flown hundreds of missions, seen cities vanish in fire, and returned to applause that never sounded like victory. Colonel Paul Tibbets, who had dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, refused interviews. When asked what he thought of Japan's surrender, he said only, "We ended it. That's all that matters." But in his flight log, the final entry was more telling. Mission complete. No joy. In Japan, the surrender brought neither joy nor relief, only exhaustion. Millions of civilians wandered through the ruins of 67 bombed cities. Rice was scarce, power non-existent, disease rampant. At night, the glow of fires no longer came from bombs, but from cooking pots and funeral pyres. The country that once dreamed of ruling the Pacific now survived by candlelight. In the ashes of Tokyo, Nurse Tomoko Hara, one of the few still treating burn victims, wrote in her final journal entry, "The sky that once rained fire is blue again. We feared the gods had abandoned us, but it was men who became gods, and men who fell from that sky." September the 2nd, 1945, Tokyo Bay. The battleship USS Missouri rocked gently on calm water. Above its deck, the same sky that had once delivered destruction now hung perfectly clear. Representatives of the Japanese government climbed the gangway in silence. They bowed stiffly before General Douglas MacArthur, who stood at the rail, his cap tilted against the morning light. The formal surrender document lay on the table, a single sheet of paper that ended the most devastating war in human history. MacArthur spoke slowly, his voice echoing across the deck and through the bay. "We are gathered here to conclude a solemn act of reconciliation. Let us not forget that peace must be built upon faith, courage, and understanding." When the Japanese foreign minister signed, the pen shook. When MacArthur signed, the world turned a page. Aboard the Missouri, anchored within sight of Tokyo, stood the ruins of a once invincible navy. The ghosts of Yamato and Musashi, of carriers sunk, of convoys burned at sea. Every Japanese admiral who had once mocked America's flying fortresses now understood that the future no longer belonged to ships. The sky had conquered the ocean. Back on Tinian, the last B-29 rolled to a stop. A crewman climbed down, pressed his hand to the coral runway, and whispered, "It started here. On a rock," they said, "was worthless." He looked up toward the horizon where the sun set blood red over the Pacific, its light reflecting off the silver wings parked in silence. Those wings had carried the weight of fire, of history, of the end itself. The empire that had once believed in divine wind, kamikaze, had been undone by a different wind. The endless, mechanical breath of engines rising from the Volcano Islands. When the war ended, Japan's survivors described their cities as fields of fire turned to dust. Historians would later call it strategic bombing. The pilots called it duty. The victims called it the night the world ended. And in the space between those truths lay the story of how the sky replaced the sea, how an empire built on waves was drowned by clouds, and how the laughter that once echoed in Tokyo's war rooms faded into the quiet hum of a world reborn beneath American wings. In the years after the war, Tokyo rose again. But beneath its steel and glass, the ground still remembers. Every foundation laid in the post-war boom sits atop layers of ash, brick, and bone. For decades, construction workers unearthed blackened tiles and melted coins, silent witnesses to the night when fire became strategy. The Tokyo Fire Department built a memorial in Sumida, near where the first incendiaries fell. Visitors walk past displays of scorched cooking pots, charred school books, and rusted bicycle frames. There are no grand monuments, no marble generals, only small relics that whisper, "It happened here." A plaque beside the exit carries a single line, "We forgot the warning of the sky." On the other side of the Pacific, Tinian became quiet again. The coral runways cracked under vines and sea wind. The barracks turned to skeletons of steel. Only the massive bomb-loading pits remain. Circular craters of concrete, where engineers once assembled the weapons that ended empires. Tourists today stand on those same runways, taking photographs where fire once rose into the heavens. The silence there is deceptive. If you close your eyes, you can still feel the tremor of engines underfoot, the echo of hundreds of bombers lifting into the dark, each carrying enough fire to erase a city. Historians would later argue about the morality of it, whether Tokyo's firebombing was necessary, whether Hiroshima was justified, whether Curtis LeMay's arithmetic of annihilation crossed a line humanity could never uncross. LeMay himself never apologized. When asked about the fire raids years later, he said simply, "We were in a war. Our job was to end it." He retired to a quiet suburb in the United States, surrounded by veterans who both revered and resented him. In private, his aides said he rarely slept through the night. He once told a reporter off the record, "You can't burn that many cities and not smell it forever." In post-war Japan, survivors tried to make sense of what had happened. The fire raids were not discussed in textbooks for decades. Too vast, too painful, too contradictory to fit into a single narrative. School children learned of Hiroshima, but few were told that a single night in March had killed more people than either atomic bomb. When the truth finally reached classrooms, the reaction was always the same: shock, disbelief, silence. A survivor, Shigematsu Niwa, wrote in his memoir, "It wasn't the bomb that destroyed Japan. It was the fire. The bomb ended the war. The fire ended us." By the 1960s, Tokyo had become the economic engine of Asia, a city of neon, glass, and concrete, proud of its rebirth. But every March 10th at midnight, bells ring near the Sumida River for the 100,000 souls lost that night. No speeches, no generals, only the sound of wind moving over the water. The same wind that once fanned the flames through the city's wooden streets. Old women still light incense on balconies facing east, toward the direction from which the bombers came. They whisper prayers not for vengeance, but for memory. At the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, a restored B-29 sits under glass, polished, enormous, gleaming like silver under the lights. Visitors walk beneath its wings, reading plaques about strategic innovation and industrial victory. Few notice the faint scorch. Marks still visible under the fuselage. Marks left by the updrafts of burning cities thousands of miles away. In one display case rests a small, charred wooden doll, recovered from Tokyo. Its label reads simply, March 10th, 1945. The space between that doll and the bomber above. It is the space between technology and humanity, between what we can do and what we should never have done. The Japanese call the night of the Great Fire Yoru no Hono, the Night of Flames. It became a phrase used in poetry, in film, in quiet conversations about loss. To survivors, it wasn't just a military event. It was the moment when the sky itself betrayed them. Because before the B-29s, the sky had been a thing of beauty, of stars, of wind, of gods, and prayer. After that night, it became a place of fear. Even decades later, the sound of thunder would make old men flinch, and children look upward in confusion. A former B-29 radio operator, Thomas Keegan, returned to Japan in 1970. He visited the site of his first mission, the district of Shitamachi, now rebuilt with high-rises and expressways. He stood at a small stone monument listing the dead and placed his hand upon it. When a Japanese journalist asked if he felt guilt, Keegan looked toward the skyline and replied, "I don't know what I feel. I only know I was there when man learned how small the world really is." He paused. "From up there, we didn't see a city. We saw a target. Down here, I see lives." And so, the story that began on volcanic islands ends under quiet skies. The B-29s are gone, the runways overgrown, the engines silent. But the lesson they left behind still hums through every machine that carries. Destruction across distance, the fire that once consumed Tokyo, lit the fuse of the modern world. Our world where cities can vanish in a night, and the horizon no longer protects us. The men who built that fire believed it would end all wars. Instead, it began a new kind, a war of reach, of machines, of skies that could never again be trusted. As dawn breaks over modern Tokyo, the city hums with life, trains rumbling, towers glowing, planes landing at Haneda. But if you stand by the Sumida River before sunrise, when the fog rolls low and the water is still, you can almost see the reflection of the flames that once danced there. They flicker for a moment, then vanish into the mist, and the city continues to live, rebuilt, renewed, and forever marked by the night when the sky itself came down to burn it.